One of the reasons I started this podcast is because, and one of the reasons that I started into my executive MBA is because I just didn't have this information. There was so much interesting information, and I would look at different places, things like YouTube or Facebook, and there's all these experts out there that are, I give them credit for trying to spread information, but sometimes I question whether it's the right information, And so one of the reasons I wanted to get more people on this podcast is to speak with people who actually know about their field, who have information, and that might not be that they are, experts in the field, but they might be people that have very interesting anecdotal information and personal experiences that could be applicable. And that to me is also super important to have access to.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was listening to some of your podcasts, it resonated with me. A lot of what I was hearing was like, yeah, that's exactly what I do. Like, I believe you had Tim Craven on.
Tim's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. And just where he was mentioning, if you don't want to actively monitor your stock investments, then you choose a 500 index fund. That's exactly, I just put it in there and I just let it ride, and try not to look at all those ups and downs. But a lot of what I saw on your podcast resonated, and I don't know, I don't know if I'm deviating from where you want to take
No.
Yeah.
Hey, no, I am all about tangents. We go where we go. Like, that's the beautiful part of all this. But first of all, I would like to go, can you introduce yourself and tell people who you are and kind of what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Eleonora Carr. I've had so many years with accounting, but so I'm an accounting subject matter expert. My career, the arc of my career, I started out as a tax accountant, a tax auditor for the state of Texas, which was really interesting because I was able to live there for about 6 months while I went through training. And then I was actually stationed in New York City, and I would audit companies that had their headquarters along the eastern seaboard, like Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and where they had what they call as a presence in Texas. So they had nexus is the term. So I would audit these companies, and so that's where I think my foundation in tax came from. I found it interesting. I found it was constantly changing. So I figured I had job security there. That led me really to, as I go through the years, I've worked for retail, a leasing company, banking, a small savings and loan bank. I was the tax manager at Citibank. Let me see what else. And then I got into the industry of higher education. And that's where I felt really at home. So I started out at a private institution. And then after working there for about 9 years, I then moved to a public state institution. And so I was really on the administrative side. And then when I think the love of learning that I sensed from your podcast, that constant learning, that's what wanted, I always wanted to go for my doctorate. And that's when I went to Temple University. It's a DBA program, so it's not a 5-year, it's a 3-year, but it's more for practitioners, right? So for me on the administrative side, to try to bridge the the gap between academia and business leaders, applying what the researchers are showing them, and the studies. And so that's where I lean towards getting my doctorate. Um, and then when I saw the position open up for Quantic, I feel I loved sharing my knowledge. I loved, even with the staff that I had, how I would manage them was, if you want to learn it, I'll show it to you, right? So the
Yeah.
joke was, if they were my favorite, then I gave them more work. So they did not want to be my favorite. So it evolved, yeah, it evolved along those lines. It was more of I guess, uh, they would get more work then, and so they joked around about it. But how else are you going to get yourself, into the position I had unless you learned everything I knew? And so if they were open to
Yeah.
that, they wanted to learn it, I absolutely shared that knowledge. And so, getting into now moving from the administrative side to the academic side of the house, it was just a nice transition for me. And I think as um, you know, maneuver through life, you find what your strengths are, like you mentioned, and
Yeah.
you have a tendency to just lean that way. And sometimes it takes a while for you to find those gifts out, or try to
Right.
understand what those gifts are. Um, yeah. So
So much so.
yeah, yeah.
It takes time. It's an exploration. I always love the analogy of whether it be a rose where the petals start to unfold, or an onion that you're getting to those inner layers to figure out what's inside. Um, that you have these layers of our journey that we kind of go through, and that there was a great Steve Jobs speech where it was this speech that he gave at a commencement, and he said you cannot connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking back. And so often we have to go through this journey to figure out who we are and where we're going and what we're doing.
Yes.
And it's kind of this unfolding, and I love that. I love this idea of being able to take your knowledge as well and to share it. To me, I come from a background in education, and I think it is such a powerful gift to give knowledge, not just basic information, but knowledge. And I think that we need to get back to knowledge being cool. At
Yeah.
least I think so, because you know knowledge, and I, not to play the to say, make this statement so cliche, but knowledge is power, but it really is.
It is.
Because when you have a certain amount of knowledge, it empowers you to make decisions, to make the right moves. To let's take a subject matter like accounting. You get two people that are, blossoming entrepreneurs. One person has a basic understanding of accounting, the other person does not. You are going to probably be having one side of the spectrum be making decisions that might be in the better interest of their company than the other side, because of a simple understanding of concepts. And that just comes from information. Doesn't mean they have to be an expert, but they do need to understand certain things to be able to succeed, because if you do not have certain grasps on certain concepts, it's going to put you in a bad space financially,
Yeah.
and that's something that is so interesting to me, that it comes back to information. If you are out journeying in bear country, you would probably want to know how to deal with bears. If you are swimming in a place that is infested with sharks, you want to know how to handle sharks. And I mean, those are kind of terrifying, but it could be something as simple. If you're going to the chocolate factory, you better be carrying a bag with you to know how to collect a certain amount of chocolate. Whatever it might be.
Yeah. And I like what you said, and when you mentioned about education, is knowledge is power. I also feel it's freedom, right? So that education
Yes.
is not right. It's not just about getting the degree or the accreditation or those credentials, but it's about freedom. Having that knowledge and being able to take it with you wherever you go. I know Tim Craven had wise words from his grandfather, and it's funny. I too, my grandfather told me to always, get that education because it's something that no one can ever take away from you. And
Yeah.
I feel it gets back to I feel it's all linked, especially you spoke to me when you said resilience in life, and I believe having, like you said, that information, that knowledge, it just makes you stronger to be able to handle those challenges, right?
Yep.
Through life we have these challenges, and how we handle them, it can really, it just makes us stronger if we approach it in that manner. Um, you know,
It's so true.
yeah. I so for my master's, the capstone that I uh, was required to submit was on leadership, and I was required to interview a number of people that I felt were leaders. And the questions were already vetted by, our professor. Um, and one of those questions had to do with how do you view failure? Have you ever failed? And the leaders that I interviewed, they were like, I never failed. It was a learning opportunity, right? So in their mind,
Yes.
it was not a failure. It was more, okay, so here's this stumbling block. Here's this challenge. Let me learn from it. And I'll, be stronger once I progress through life. So um, just looking at that as, everything that's thrown at you during life, how you can try to view it as perhaps an opportunity. Um, yeah, and I just want to tell you another story. One thing, when I was
I
working
love
in
it.
New York City, um, and I believe they still do this, right? But women, instead of wearing high heels, we'd have our sneakers on, right? So here I am. I took the subway into New York, and uh, hiking it, from the west side to the east side to get to Citibank. And as I'm walking down the sidewalk, there's all these cardboard boxes. You have these homeless sleeping in the cardboard boxes. And just as I was approaching this one cardboard box, this gentleman stepped out of this cardboard. He came out of this cardboard box. He was in a suit. And we ended up where we're walking, very close to each other on the sidewalk. And in that moment, I was, well, here's other people walking, viewing us. They can't tell which one of us came out of that, was homeless, right? There was no distinguishing characteristics between me or
Yeah.
himself. We were both heading to work, and that's where I
Yeah.
think it really, it drove home in my mind. Well, that education, even if I'm down on my luck, so much happens and I'm living out of a cardboard box. Could I be as resilient as this gentleman who obviously,
Yeah.
was doing the best he can to get himself back up on his feet? So, yeah, it was just
The-
something that struck me as I was
It
traversing life.
reminds me of that movie. Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of that Will Smith movie, The Pursuit of Happiness,
Yes.
where that character was also down on his luck, but he had his ingenuity. He had his work ethic. He had his level of knowledge, and he had this inner
Yeah.
thing that no matter what was happening wasn't able to be taken away from him. And I think there is something to be said for that. This, and this was one of the things that I'm trying to teach my daughter today. She had her year-end exams, and we're pretty sure she did not as well as she would have liked on her Vietnamese exams. And she's studying in a bilingual program. And I said to her, I pulled her aside, and I said, before she even went into the exam, I said, "You're going to have your exam today." And she said, "Yes." And I looked at her and I said, "I don't care how you do in your exam." She's like, "What?" I was like, "I don't care." I said, "The first day of the year, when you came to this school, you barely spoke any Vietnamese. And now you're speaking to your mom fluently in Vietnamese all the time. And that to me is way more important." And I said, "So whatever you get on your exam, it's great.
Yeah.
It's not a problem."
That's fun.
But I didn't let her sit there in that though too. I said, "And then tomorrow we go back to work. And you keep learning. In this summer, you're going to be watching as many of your favorite cartoons on Netflix. We're going to rewatch them in Vietnamese." Because you can't rest on your laurels, but you do have what you earned, and it's something that no one can take that away from you, And I think that that's so powerful and important. And it's any type of knowledge you gotta see how I can phrase this. I'm a black belt in judo. And one of the things that I learned was to be kind of direct. And my martial arts training has always made me kind of not afraid to speak my mind. Because if a situation ever were to not go the way I wanted, I know I can defend myself. And so yesterday, I saw this gentleman, and I was outside the ATM, and it was a Western guy, and he was wearing some overalls and looked like he'd been out on drinking all night, which people do, it's okay. I'm not judging that. But what happened next, I did judge. He finished at the ATM. His receipt came out. He looked around, wadded the paper up and threw it on the ground. And so he was getting ready to walk away, and I was like, "That's not a trash can." And I looked at him and I said, and he's like, "What?" I said, "That's not a trash can." And I said, "You can pick up your trash." And he said, "Okay." And he picked it up and he's looking around, and I said, "There's no trash can." And I said, "Find one. Find one. Find one. You have pockets, right? You can put that in your pocket for now and find one. There will be one." And one of the things that I try to impress upon my daughter is that even though we can be okay, we can still be better. And that's one of the reasons that I am always driven to learn more.
Yeah.
And people ask me, "Would you want to live forever?" And so many people say, no, I would never. I would.
Would you?
But not because I'm afraid of death or dying or any of that. I would love to understand all of this. What is it? The meaning of everything, and to learn as much as I can and to be as good as I can, the best that I could be, find my potential. And that's something that always drives me forward, is to be better. I don't know how that's related to what we're talking about, but I feel like that knowledge and information is something that all of us have a better version of ourselves that we can aspire to. There was this great, I've been reading this book called Ikigai, and it's talking about the Japanese philosophy of Ikigai, and it looks at, it's essentially boils down to what is your meaning of life, and it all about finding that meaning in your life. What is it that is there for you, and this beauty of finding your own personal path and meaning. And they interviewed all these people about what was truly special in their life. And Ikigai is Ikigai, if you want to know. It's a good book.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they look at how for all of us, one of the most important things is finding that thing, whatever it is for you. Whatever is that thing that gives you spark. Is it finding knowledge? Is it excellence of some sort. And they reference this great movie. I think it's called Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And it's essentially the story of this 80-year-old sushi maker in Japan. And one of the things that they found too is a couple things. One, never retire. If you want to live a long life, never retire, or at least find a second thing or third thing that you can do, because what they found in Jiro Dreams of Sushi talked about how this 80-year-old guy would still go to the market every day to find the best fish. And then every single day he would try to craft and cut the perfect sushi. And he had this one intern that worked with him for like 40 years. And for 40 years, he had been trying to make an egg. And Jiro never gave him his approval until like after 40 years. One day, Jiro looked at him and said, "Your egg is sufficient now." But the story is about how people will dedicate themselves to something, but you have to find out what it is that is important to you. Maybe for one person, it is to be the greatest entrepreneur they could be. Maybe for another person, it is to simply be the best dad. Or another person, it's to, be the greatest pitcher of all time. Whatever it might be, can you dedicate yourself to something that is worthy of you? It's beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. And I feel again, it's where just trying to meander through life, and you find this, right? You find what really makes you happy, and and like you said, I tried all these different industries as I was going through my career, and it wasn't until I was in higher education that I felt, okay, now, sharing that knowledge was what was important for me, and just makes you feel good, right? Whenever you do something for someone else, it just makes you feel good. We just got back from a couple of days vacation down in Florida, and we were visiting a friend of ours that he's 92, and he, like you said, is still active, still, he volunteers. He's a tax attorney, a CPA, so he volunteers as much as he can. But it was funny because, I forget how he worded it, but it was like, well, I'm giving you the opportunity to help me. It's like I'm giving you that benefit, that great feeling to help someone. So so we got a good chuckle out of that, because it's true. You just feel good when you're able to guide someone, help someone, especially if they're struggling. And I think a lot of the executive MBA students that I see, they're very maybe it's because of the experience that they have. They know if they have a question, it's a valid question, and they're not afraid to ask it. But I believe what I see is with the MBA students now, they're not so maybe solidified in their careers, or they don't have that experience yet to feel comfortable in asking those questions. And so I feel like I have to pull it out of them, and let them know that it's okay. It's okay to have those questions. We're, like you said, we're all so brilliant. We all have our gifts. And so having that question is valid, right? Yeah.
What? Let's imagine that you. Can I ask you a question then, a little bit about that?
Yes.
If you were to start talking to some students about what are some of the concepts that you think are really most important for people, business people, entrepreneurs, executive MBA students, what are some of these concepts that you think are really things that, like, this right here, this you need to pay attention to? What are some of those concepts that you really think are really crucial to pay attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I
It's loaded.
It is, because as you were saying, I'm like, oh, that. Um, I feel a lot of students, when they're looking at, say, financial statements, they'll just focus on that income statement. They'll see the revenue and expenses. They'll see that net profit, and they'll say, okay, that's a really successful business because look at the net profit, the value. Um, but that's only part of the story. And one thing I've noticed among, sitting around that boardroom table, I could tell, which VPs had a knowledge of accounting with the revenues, expenses, and then also the balance sheet with the cash, just by the questions they would ask. And a lot of board members would confuse revenue and expenses to cash. And it's a common error that I feel really needs to be stressed. And so whenever I was presenting financial statements to board members, not only would I give them, the revenue and expenses projection, the income statement, but also I would give them a cash budget so they can see the difference between the two. So they can see, okay, just because we got all this revenue in, not all of it was cash, right? Some of it they're going to pay us later. So I would absolutely show them, really, basically, it's just your bank statement. It's just looking at your cash, what cash came in, what cash went out. And so that's where I could see, the connection in their mind, like they got the difference between the two. So I feel that's really important for students to understand. Accountants were required to use accrual accounting, not cash, accounting. So understanding that difference and knowing that looking at that cash position, looking at what your cash is so important to survive. There, a lot of businesses will become bankrupt, will go bankrupt if they don't monitor their cash position, if they don't have enough cash to pay their vendors and pay their liabilities. So I feel that's really key to understanding and being successful with their business, is just knowing that difference. Yeah.
And we're in a time of financial upheaval for many companies where, we are seeing right now that companies are having to go into pretty major, finding major solutions to cut back on a lot of their costs and their overhead. You see, it was LinkedIn fired, I believe, 700 people today, and it was maybe even more. And so there are a lot of these companies that it's interesting to see that. Do you find that people misread signs, or they just aren't paying attention to what the numbers are, or what do you think some of those things might be?
I feel it might be that they just didn't anticipate the market to take a turn as maybe drastically as it did. I, everything that I've seen with upper management, they are monitoring, looking at budgets, preparing. This one institution that I worked for, when COVID hit, I was really impressed at how well management, looked at first operating expenses, not salaries, not trying to lay off any of the workers, right? So that was the resort, of least attack as how they were going to manage those expenses. So they absolutely looked at the different departments' budgets. They slashed those budgets, meaning those expenses such as supplies or conferences or those type of items were immediately cut back to try to accommodate. And so you anticipate, right, what's going to happen in the market. And sometimes, like with COVID, we did not anticipate it to be so long, right? So you make these adjustments in your budget. You make these adjustments based off of past history, but that's not a a good way to well, how do I word this, right? The past isn't really a way to anticipate the future as to what's going to happen. You do the best you can with that historical, but sometimes I think companies, you do the best to keep your staff. You do the best to keep that, and then when you've cut as much as you can with these other expenses, there's nothing left, right? But to look at those employees and start cutting there. So that's my guess. When they're, what I've seen with management, they're doing everything they can. They know the value of their employees.
Definitely.
And so if it's any, I'm struggling for the words. I'm not a verbal person.
You're doing great.
Thanks, Sean. Give me numbers and I am in my element.
Give me words and I'm in my element. So the number side crushes me. Well, let me ask you this. What are in your opinion, what are some of the most important financial metrics for entrepreneurs to track their business?
Wow. Wow, that's a good one too, because I believe it really depends on the industry that you're in. I think
that's interesting. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So with higher education, right, there were specific, you would monitor your general ratios and in any program of study, right, what we try to give to the students are those general ratios, like the net profit margin, like the gross margin, looking at the quick ratio, knowing the debt to equity, or a lot of analysts on Wall Street will look at the earnings per share if it's a public company and they're issuing stock, right? So the earnings per share, or that the price to equity, that PE ratio, right? So I'm spitting out all these general ratios, but when you go in your industry, and especially if you're being rated by the rating agencies like Fitch, Standard & Poor's, right? They're going to get these ratios, right? They're going to start with the standard ratios, but then they're going to look at the different industry nuances and make adjustments to those. So for instance, in higher education, there were some accounting pronouncements that we were required to implement. For state public institutions, we had to start recording an entry related to pensions. So I'll try to give a quick overview here. So the state government is responsible for funding every state employee's pension, right? So it's held at the state level. And so what the accounting pronouncement wanted to do is, they wanted a reporting down to the municipalities, townships, state universities, community colleges. What portion of that total that's being held by the state government is related to your organization. So we're providing additional information for the readers of the financial statements to see what that liability would be. But it's really a fake liability because these state institutions or those municipalities are not responsible for that because it's being held at that state level, the governmental level there. But we were required to record these entries, which just destroyed, just made our financials look awful. And so in the management discussion and analysis, we would explain this to the readers that this isn't our liability, but what we're trying to show to the readers is if this was held at our level, this is what the liability would be for the employees that we have and their pension. And so when the rating agencies would come in, they would absolutely eliminate this when they were looking at our financial health and our stability. So it was these kind of nuances within the industry. There's another ratio that I feel is very important for higher education institutions and probably hospitals, right? I think of the hospital industry, health industry, and that would be deferred maintenance. So let me explain this. Like, that's something that a lot of other industries would not have to deal with. So when you have a brick and mortar campus, you're trying to entice these students. You want to increase your enrollment. And so you're having these tours on campus and you're pointing out all this great, infrastructure, capital projects that you're implementing. We have a new computer lab. We have this new arts and science building going up. We have this new theater, right? You're trying to increase enrollment with all this glamorous type of construction that's going on. Nobody wants to hear about the maintenance of the roof or the new boiler that you need or those type of, colleges, universities, they have a tendency to defer them, right? Because you're trying to use those funds to increase your enrollment. And so that's one of the important ratios that we would relay to, I would calculate this and relay it to the president, to the board, but also the rating agencies would definitely want to look at that. And we would have the rating agencies come in because we issued bonds, right? And so they would come in and look at our financial health and re-rate those bonds. And so it was important for us to present this, really healthy. We had to monitor all these ratios to be able to show that, right, we our enrollment may have dropped, but we are managing the deferred maintenance. We're managing the maintenance on the roof of that building and these non so glamorous projects that need to be done, right? That just won't increase enrollment, but they're essential. And so that's what I mean by looking at the different industries and knowing exactly which ratios would be important for that particular industry.
There's something there that you pointed out, and I think this is something that that popped into my mind when I was studying accounting. Everyone wants to talk about the glamorous. Everyone wants to go into and dive into Apple launching the iPhone. That event was a transformative event for a company, right? But they don't want to talk about the day-to-day, things that go into running a company. Like, you're not going to have an iPhone to launch if you do not have someone accounting for what are your expenses? A company like Apple, they're going to have something like something as seemingly simple as making sure that every bathroom has toilet paper. Like, that is something that a company has to have. And if you do not have toilet paper for your employees, if you do not have soap in the bathrooms, if you do not budget for that, if you are not putting that into practice, then you will not attract the best talent. You will not attract the best employees. You will not be able to get the engineers who can create this device. And that comes back to, we want to talk about the glamorous. And I feel like for a lot of people, the accounting is not the glamorous, but it's so important. And we can shift away from companies back into even people's own personal lives. We all would like to take the trip here, to get this here. And then one of the things that I think Tim was talking about, sometimes those investments that he was making were not glamorous. They were not flashy. They were not things that people were going to write home about, but they worked. And over time, they created something bigger. There was this great movie in the 90s called, I'm blanking on all of my names today. Greenfingers. It was Greenfingers. Just as I go to search for it. Greenfingers. So Clive Owen plays an ex-con. He's robbed, and he goes to prison in England. And while in prison, he gets into gardening with some of the other inmates there, and they start creating a plot to garden. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting is that, the warden started teaching them that to grow something, you put things in the ground. You plant seeds, and then you water it, and you have to be patient. But you also have all of these things that are going on, and everyone comes along and they see the flowers. They see a completed garden, but people do not understand the process that went into that. And even with having a garden, there has to be a budget for supplies. There has to be a budget for what's going out. You have to know how much you're spending. You have to know where you're going to make, returns. But yet, if you can put the right things into place, you can create something amazing, whether that be a company, whether that be your own personal finances, whether that be setting aside money for your children's college. I mean, whatever it might be that you are trying to create, you can accomplish it. But you just have to maybe find a new way to do it. And I love that. Like, I was reading this book by Ramit Sethi, I believe is his name, and he talks about how, everyone is looking at all of the fancy stuff for money, and he's like, yet some people are like, I can't save money, I'm barely making it. And he's like, you can change your situation.
Yes.
If you set your mind to something, if you believe in it, you can find solutions. You can find ways through your challenges. And so I love it because, again, coming back to not everything's fancy. When people see my videos, these videos look beautiful when I share them, but they don't understand that I sit there and I email about 25 people a day asking them to be on my podcast. And the 90%, 95% say no. And the people that come on are a absolute treasure for me, because these are people that are willing to take a chance on me. And I love speaking and hearing their stories and crafting something beautiful. But there's a lot of work that goes into it. I have to download all the files. I've got to create the templates. I have to edit it. I have to sit there. I have to watch the whole thing, cut out all the ums, ers, ahs, and then go into finding what are the little 1-minute segments that I can cut out and use as a reel that are going to be the thing that draw people to this greater, more inspiring story. Because, goodness gracious, I'd love for people to listen to the whole thing. But you have to go through this process. And I think that that's what people forget about when we see that garden. When we see what other people have grown, we don't realize all the work that went into that. Apple today, I think, launched some type of bank service, and there was over 1 billion dollars invested into their savings accounts, like in one day or something. It was an insane number. I'd have to double check the facts on that, but it was this thing that was just very like, wow. And then the newspapers were talking about it. And what popped into my head, what they said is that people trust Apple more than they trust many banks, because Apple has established this reputation. But again, people didn't look at, and I'm not saying I like Apple or I don't like Apple. I'm just saying it was something that was built over time. I remember the first Mac that I had back in the 80s. It was like a little tiny screen, and it was not the preferred computer. I remember we used Macs, and they were not cool. All my friends had PCs, and they had cool games, and we had Macs in my house, and people were like, "You guys have a Mac." You're one of those families. And but that's what we had. But then suddenly there was just this time put in. And again, coming back to, we have to, as business people, as students, as professionals, remember that sometimes the stuff that is not glamorous is the foundation. And that's what I got of when I was studying accounting. I was like, oh my goodness, how do people not know this? How is this not a general subject taught in high school? Like, this really should be taught to everyone.
Yeah, I agree. I feel there, having that finance, just understanding the accounting will just help you in all aspects of your life, and will get you on that and maybe being an accountant. I believe so strongly about this, but getting you on that financial path, right? And I agree. When our daughters were growing up, and I'm grateful that I found a mate that believed in education as much as I did. And so we didn't go on those fancy vacations every year, right? We saved, we brought our lunch, we brown bagged it every day. And I saw, all my coworkers, going out for lunch. And so all of that, right? You make these sacrifices for that, what you believe in. And you try to, focus on that goal, and there's the end result. And like you said, it's a long journey. And so, I thought of you with your young daughter, and, now that I've made it through, and my children are grown, they're on their own. I feel like I can look back now and say, well, those were wonderful years, right? You struggled, but you made it through. And when you're going through it, you're like, yeah, this is not, I am not enjoying this.
Right.
Because it's hard. It's so hard. But if it was easy, then it wouldn't be so satisfying at the end, right? If we didn't have to struggle, to try to get there. And I think, again, when I went through a number of the summaries for your podcast, and I have to go back and listen to them all, because there were threads throughout that just, were exactly how our thinking was in raising our children and in just getting through it. And like you said, there's a lot that just isn't glamorous, and that's okay, right?
Right.
Right. Like Tim said too, in purchasing a house, you don't, you can invest in a home for 3 to 5 years, and then just build that equity. It doesn't have to be your permanent, ideal home that you're thinking of. And so, I agree with all of that. And I feel too, this kind of gets to when you mentioned, with the employees and those people that are getting all that work done in the business. No one, really understands that foundation, that support that's there, whether you're talking about HR or accounting or IT, all are necessary for a business. Um, and then I feel that goes to the whole, environmental, social governance, right? If you're looking at that aspect, not just the finances, not looking just at that glamorous, okay, you made a profit, but also looking at your employees, looking at, um, that governance and how you're treating your employees or,
Yes.
yeah, so um, I feel there's a lot that goes into it, a lot that has evolved. Um, when I was in my undergrad, I studied economics, and everything was profit oriented, right? Milton
Yeah.
Friedman, it's your stockholders. That's what you have to gear, everything towards, and we've evolved now where that companies to survive they need to look at this. It's not abs it's not just the stockholders but your stakeholders, right? And so you have to somehow try to uh, marry the two, try to collaborate so that you're looking at that environmental, that social, that governance, looking at your employees and providing those benefits, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's so important.
There was there was this the new Nike movie just came out by
Oh,
with Matt Damon and Ben Affleck. I
oh,
mean, Ben Affleck is the director. I think it's called Air, and it didn't do really well in the box office, but it talked about the story of Nike, and Nike was this struggling shoe company. They were struggling, and people can't even process that now. Like Nike's just this beast of a company, but at some point in time, they were barely making it, and they took a chance on going heavy on brand, going heavy on story, and talking about the whole just do it, message. And then they took it, they took a chance on this guy, Michael Jordan, and the rest is history, But it wasn't just about selling shoes. It was about having this message that is more, and there was a great documentary that came out with Ryan Reynolds and I can't remember his friend's name, the guy from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Um,
oh, oh,
it,
that's a good.
they're co-owners of Wrexham Football Club in England, or it's actually Wales. I believe Wrexham is in Wales, and it talks about how they took a chance on this small football team that now has grown back and is now part of the Premier League and moved back up to the top level. And it's about how the story, and we've entered in this period where the story is as important as anything else. You are crafting something more, and part of the story is how people care for their employees. Ben and Jerry's, was always, it's all about the workers. And then I like the company Taylor Guitar in San Diego is a great guitar maker, employee owned, and the stories there are just powerful. And I think we're entering into this beautiful time where we've put this art back into it as well. That there's just this beauty that of crafting something beautiful, and people care
Yeah,
about the product. People care about the story. People care about the message. It's important. It's not all profit anymore, is what I'm saying.
yes.
It's there's so much more to it. Granted, everyone wants to make money,
Yeah,
but there people recognize that there is more to the equation.
yeah, absolutely. And again, looking at companies' financials, even just looking, are they meeting that mission? Are they reaching, what they're actually in the business of? I think back again for higher education, and one thing I would want to see as I was, comparing year over year is, are we increasing? Are we putting most of our funding in the academic area, in that,
Hmm.
the functional category, and not so much the administrative, right? I didn't want to see a large increase in administrative, because that's not our mission. Our mission, it was education, and so that's where you want to see that funding go. Um, yeah, so I feel all, like, just going back to what you had mentioned, um, looking at those companies, knowing how to understand the accounting, and understanding the finances of the profit. Not really, absolutely, you have to cover your expenses. You have to try to make somewhat of a profit to see you into the next year. But when you think of not-for-profit organizations, there's going to be years where they won't show, a profit at all, because they're meeting their mission, right? So they might
Yes.
expend more of their funding that year towards that mission, and that's okay, right? And that's where I go
Yeah.
back to the cash. That's okay, as long as you've got that cash to see you through that next year, right? So yeah, it's funny. It comes around, right? It's just
Yeah.
it's all connected. Yeah, and it's all so important. Every piece of it.
One last question. We'll finish up with this. If you could go back in time and give yourself some financial advice for when you were younger, what advice would you give yourself?
To have some short term goals. I think maybe that's where that experience through the years taught me, hey, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? But
Yeah.
when I started out, in my mind, so I'm a thinker planner, right? So I'm not going to jump
Yeah.
until I've got it all planned out. Um, and so maybe letting go of that a little bit, and really setting some short-term goals to get you to that long-term goal that you were striving for, and not, you know, I think what I did through my career is, I just kind of maneuver. I was sort of like in flux. Okay, this will work. I'll go here. I didn't
Yeah.
have any definitive, goal. Like, no, I'm not going to take that position, because that's not going to get me where I want to go. I'm going to take this one,
Mm.
or I'm going to keep looking. And so maybe more so in having those definitive goals in life, short term, um, so that it'll get you to where you eventually want to be. Yeah, I think maybe
I love
along
that.
those lines. Yeah, that was a
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I think that is something though that people don't think about. I think, my parents were really like open, study whatever you want, go do whatever you want, and I wish that they had been like, no, some of the choices you make early in your life are important, and have a vision, even if that vision is understanding yourself better, and but have a path that you're seeking out, and to think about those longer term plans with short term goals.
yeah,
It's kind of that balance to have.
yeah.